My name's Peter Pomerantsev, and I never really set out to study propaganda. It's really happened by accident. After university, I lived for 10 years in Russia. I went to film school there. I ended up working in TV there, and around me, I saw kind of this new phenomenon arise, which we'll be exploring today, which seemed to be rewriting the rules of propaganda. Which, is somebody who was working in media, who had a background in film, who before that had studied literature and history. I was fascinated by it. When I came back to Britain after 10 years in Russia, I wrote a book about it. Nothing is true and everything is possible, which was my first book, which was kind of a memoir mixed with analysis of this weird media and propaganda system. And by that time, I'd realized that something weird was going on, something new was going on. And I wanted to see if it was going on in the whole world. And I went from working in media to kind of analyzing it for think tanks and then at the LSE. And I created a research initiative, which has now moved to Johns Hopkins, called ARENA, which I run with Anne Applebaum, the historian, trying to work out what's new and trying to work out what we do about it. And I'll get in more detail to our work in the third session. So this is something that I'm very much someone who worked in TV in Russia and in the West, and I've ended up sort of taking a step out of it. I still do a lot of media, largely radio. I do a lot of BBC 4 work, and I still carry on writing books. My second book is called This Is Not Propaganda. The third book that I'm writing at the moment is about the Second World War propaganda. And those who know the books know that they're not academic books. They're very much slightly experimental works of creative nonfiction. I quote a lot of academics. I look at lots of academic stuff, but I'm still very much interested in narrative nonfiction storytelling. So in that sense, I'm a kind of a weird creature with one part of my brain still very much in the kind of creative space, and one half of it now in the very drier but equally fascinating space of kind of academic research, which makes me some sort of hybrid, I suppose. How I've decided to do this, how I decided to do this is I will talk then today a little bit about my experience in Russia. I'm almost going to take my life and my writing in order, because that's the easiest way for me to make sense of it. So we're going to move from kind of my quite personal recollections and attempts to understand the propaganda model in Russia in session 1. Next week, we'll talk about the global the global landscape. We'll be going from the Philippines to Mexico to really messed up places like the USA, trying to find the underlying patterns. What's happening in different countries, and what does it mean for the way we make sense of propaganda and the opposite of it. A healthy democratic information space. In many ways, you will know the American context better than me. I go to America a lot. Now I'm officially working there, though I'm in London because COVID means that nobody's in Hopkins at the moment. We're all working from home, which in my case means London. But what maybe I'd like you to think about is the patterns, the similarities between what's going on in America and the Philippines and Britain and Ukraine, and so on and so forth. Because I do think we're seeing a global phenomenon, and I do find each nation can tend to get locked into its own little drama, not realizing that actually what we're seeing is a global pattern. And as I said, session 3 is going to be all about solutions. I'll be telling you about the work we do at ARENA. I'll be telling you about the other interesting work that I think is being done in the regulatory space and in the kind of refashioning democratic communications. But we're going to brainstorm a lot together. We're going to do a lot of thinking together because no one has the solution to this crisis. So let me sort of begin at my beginning. As I said, after university, I went to Russia. I went to film school. Ended up working in the media there. Ended up doing entertainment stuff. My background is not in the serious stuff. I ended up working for a channel that didn't do any news. So we're talking here sort of so I moved to Russia in 2001, went to film school, worked on documentaries, and actually started working with Russian TV channels in 2006, and I left in 2010. And you know, just so you understand, I mean, I went to film school, like a lot of people who won't go to film school. I dreamt of then becoming an auteur filmmaker, and then reality hits, and the only real jobs out there are in TV. And so I ended up working for entertainment channels. Russian TV was booming at that point. So like the channel that I worked with and the production company I worked for, you know, they were doing things like, you know, bringing the reality shows over to Russia and bringing factual entertainment over to Russia and bringing stand-up comedy over to Russia. And you know, just as an anecdote, it's the good thing about working in entertainment TV is that you do get to really understand society. It's actually a wonderful form of sociology. You really find out what makes people tick, what makes them laugh, what makes them cry, what people watch. And in that sense, it was fabulous because, you know, the company I worked for, they brought The Apprentice over to Russia. The Apprentice, as you know, is a show which has some political consequences and is, you know, just briefly sort of digress. I mean, the Russian version of The Apprentice was really, really well made. They actually had a real oligarch playing the Donald Trump role, not a Trumpian figure who might not even be a billionaire. They had a real billionaire in that kind of position, a guy called Potanin, very scary guy. It was all very well produced. I mean, the way these things work, you have consultants from, I think, Sony or the rights, or Endemol, coming over, you know, teaching the local TV channels how to make these shows. It's all very well done, very high quality production values, great storylines, great characters, great music, everything is great. But Russia is one of the few countries in the world where The Apprentice flopped entirely. And you know the reason it flopped? The reason it flops is this is not how Russians think you make money. Russians don't think you make money by having a great business idea and you know, developing it and marketing it. I mean, if you do that, the chances are you're going to end up in jail, like Michael Hodorkovsky or some clever Russian oligarch whose business got too successful and was taken away by the state. In Russia, you're like, you know, the audiences think you make money by, you know, extortion, political corruption, you know, not through these like, hey, here's a business solution to my, you know, to my little idea. No one bought that in Russia. That didn't correspond to Russian realities. Other reality shows did very well. So the Russian version of Survivor, you know, take a bunch of people, dump them on an island where they have to survive through huge hardship and danger. Russians are like, oh, we know that. That's Russian history. That's the Gulag. That's, you know, the Russian weather. This is how we understand this. And the Russian version of Survivor, I think, is still beating all the ratings. 7 p.m. You know, it works really well. So already, I mean, what I'm trying to say is they're already working in entertainment television. You're constantly thinking about what makes a society tick. What are its rules? How does it function? And, you know, by the way, I'm sure Donald Trump actually in that sense does understand a lot about what makes Americans tick. You know, it's not a coincidence that somebody who, you know, managed to do really well on entertainment TV probably understands big parts of the American public. It is great training. And in Ukraine, you have a president who had he's a stand-up comedian. He had the most highest rating shows on TV. And again, you become a very good sociologist making mass entertainment. But obviously I was also looking at the media system around me, and it was a very strange media system. So this is a time when Russia was experimenting with something they called sovereign democracy or managed democracy. So if you switch on Russian TV, even now, but especially then, it looked just like Western TV, the political TV. There were non-stop political debating shows. You know, there was, you'd switch on the TV and there would be a really right-wing nationalist screaming at a kind of beetroot-faced old communist, you know, with a slightly effete liberal trying to talk about values and human rights. And they'd all be screaming at each other like in a good political debate, just like in an American political debate, maybe slightly more constructive than American political debate, judging from what happened the other night. So you had parties. It wasn't the Soviet Union. You had different parties. You had a liberal democratic party, which was kind of neo-fascist, but still. You had a communist party. You had a genuine liberal party. You had all these different parties. But what you worked out pretty quickly in Russia, that even though you had different parties, all of them were actually controlled by the Kremlin. As in, some of them had been created by the Kremlin, and some of them were just kind of dictated to by the Kremlin, or told within which very small confines of debate they could actually, they could actually compete in. So some small things about social policy, but never anything big about, foreign policy or big economic policy, or, things that really would change people's lives. So essentially this was like another reality show. This wasn't a reality show where there was a very controlled amount of pluralism. And kind of the aim of all of it, as one spin doctor told me, really the aim of all of it was always to show there is no alternative to Putin. So here are the alternatives. Here's the crazy right-wing party. Do you really want to vote for them? Here's the, geriatric communist party. Do you really want to vote for them? And here's the liberal party. Look, they're not even Russian. They're kind of weird Westerners talking about gender rights. That's not, that doesn't appeal to us. So the whole thing was constructed in a way, what they call managed democracy, as a kind of a reality show, with the ultimate purpose being to make Putin look really good by contrast. Because looking at all of these, you're like, well, Putin is obviously so much better. And that wasn't the only thing that had changed from kind of the propaganda system of the Soviet Union, which is what I associated Kremlin propaganda with. Back then there was, not only was there only one party, the Communist Party, there was only kind of one ideology. Now you did actually have these different kind of, this kind of like charade of democracy. But if there was really one ideology, sorry, my son is just asking me a question. Sorry, I've got a 10-year-old that I'm looking after. 1 second.
So sorry.
Yeah. Perfect.
It's
eat it. Yes, eat it.
All of it.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry. It's the limitations of COVID life. And he's just got home from school, and I heated him a vegetarian lasagna. Sorry. But there, so there wasn't one great ideology anymore. There wasn't one great kind of, this is the communist truth and you must aspire to it. There was something else. There was something that I would kind of call almost an ideology of cynicism, because, everybody knew that the parties in Russia were fake. Everyone knew that they were controlled. People weren't being conned in a way. They were being offered this spectacle, which was entertaining in its own way. But the underlying message was, look, here's what democracy is. It's all a bit of a sham. It's all a bit of a sham here. It's all a bit of a sham in the West. In the West, they have debates. We have debates. That our system is a bit rigged. Their system is just as rigged by, there's Democrats and Republicans, but deep down, the deep state controls all of it. There was kind of this, instead of, the communism with its hypocritical maybe, but language of ideals and the future and big ideas, here it was this kind of, this idea that everything is rotten, everything is show, everything is PR. That was kind of the buzzword that you'd hear. Everything is PR. Democracy is PR. Values is PR. Human rights is PR. All of these things they're just for show. And almost by putting on a show and making their own democracy into a sham show, they were kind of saying, well, it's the same in the West as well. Their BBC or their CNN, they're rigged as well. This idea of the whole world, that everything is rigged, that there are actually no higher values to aspire to. And that kind of came along with instead of people talking about Cold War all the time, which, the Cold War, which was a competing system of values, there's another kind of quasi-replacement ideology-ish that had come in, or a language, which was about information war. That everything is information war. Information war in kind of the Russian context is not just a technical kind of foreign policy or military doctrine. It's much, much more than that. It was really a kind of quasi-philosophy that had been, launched by a bunch of academics with ties to the security service in the late 1990s. And it was a revisionist vision of history, which basically said the Soviet Union didn't lose the Cold War because of terrible policies or terrible values, but because of information viruses planted by the West. Human rights, freedom of expression, democracy, these are all information manipulations, campaigns. And, this idea that everything that we see in the world has no values, everything is rotten, everything is just information war, it kind of grew and grew and grew during my time in Russia, especially as the Kremlin needed to explain big protests against Putin, or the overthrow of authoritarian kleptocrats in the Middle East or in Ukraine. It was always, this is just information war from the West. All these investigations into Putin's corruption, that's information war. It's just a plot. very cynical worldview, yeah, where everything, no criticism is genuine. It's very hard to have a kind of a values-based argument or a factual argument around something, because everything is manipulation. And if everything is manipulation, it's just a case of us and them, and the bad enemy is trying to manipulate us. You just split the world up into our guys and their guys, and there is kind of no space for facts or values or aspirations. And along with that disappearance of aspirations, there's another new thing in this world which really struck me, which was there was no vision of the future. There was no communism aspired to some burning gulag on the hill, but it was aspiring to something. There was some idea of the future where everybody was meant to be headed, and instead Russian discourse just seemed to be full of this kind of misty nostalgia, but it wasn't a precise nostalgia. It wasn't nostalgia for 1968 or 1974. It was just this vague sense that we've got to bring Russia off its knees, make it big and powerful again, but which really wasn't articulated in anything specific, just this vague, nebulous sense. And so this kind of weird world where the future had been a place of nostalgia, where there's an overarching kind of quasi-ideology that, information war and manipulation and cynicism is really the way to interpret the world. And with that, there was this sense that language was sort of coming apart all the time. That, I mentioned there was a liberal democratic party, but it was neither liberal nor democratic. It was kind of neo-nationalist, really. There was a communist party, but they were kind of religious social democrats. There were elections, but they were so rigged, they weren't really elections. So, there's the sense that kind of the language that we use to define ideology and political identity was kind of floating and was kind of moving around. And instead, there was just this kind of amorphous idea of the majority, the Putinskaya большинство, the Putin majority, which you were either part of or not part of. And it was constantly moving. And we were constantly being told that, well, that opinion, that's not a majority opinion. That's a minority opinion. There is a majority, a people, some sort of clump out there that is cohesive, though it's never sociologically defined. And it's very strange living in this world because, when you're surrounded with this kind of cynicism, it's very hard to argue with it. It's very hard to make an argument for values or for reforms because, there's this deep-seated cynicism. And at some point, facts really stopped mattering in this discourse. It was very, very strange. I mean, when the Soviets lied, and they lied a hell of a lot, they were still put up a facade that their lying was the truth. So, for example, random example, when the Soviets did a disinformation campaign in the Cold War against the Americans, a very famous one in the 70s and 80s, alleging that the American CIA had created AIDS as a weapon. When Ronald Reagan confronted Gorbachev with this, saying, like, this is a piece of disinformation, it's very damaging, health risks associated with it, Gorbachev acted appalled. He was like, how dare you say that the great scientific, Marxist Soviet Union would lie? We believe in objective facts. We care about them. He was lying about caring, but he still pretended that facts mattered. And if you think about the Soviet Union, it was constantly churning out numbers to prove that its great economic policies were succeeding, even though everybody knew they were not. But here in Putin's Russia, it was very strange. It was if you were caught out lying, it didn't matter. There was one scandal after the next that would come out around, for example, about ministers' corruption, or about how they had faked their diplomas. There was a whole campaign by civil society showing, look, all these ministers who pretend to have PhDs, they faked them. And they were like, yeah, we did, so what's the big deal? Facts aren't really that important. Who cares? This kind of brazenness to factual language and to factual discourse, which was really quite striking. And again, made it very, very hard to kind of find a way to kind of criticize the state and for your criticisms to have any weight. So anyway, in around 2010, having lived in this strange soup of, new propaganda and cultural quirks, I returned to Britain, and spent a lot of my time in Britain and America, and I was sort of telling myself, look, the West might be bad in many ways, but at least we have politicians who care if they're caught out lying, yeah, and at least we have an idea of the future. And at least we have a clear political language about liberals and conservatives, and we know what those terms mean. And at least we don't trade in this kind of weird, amorphous nostalgias. We have a clear idea of the future and where we're going. And then lo and behold, 2016 happens. And everywhere around me, certainly in Britain with Brexit, certainly in America with the election of Donald Trump, but also throughout Europe, I suddenly see all these phenomena that I'd seen in Russia in the 2000s and have been so prevalent there in the 1990s already, sprouting all over what we used to think of as the West, and especially the Anglosphere. Again, we see politicians who don't care if they're caught out lying. They just brazen it out. They don't seem to mind. And instead of a politics of the future, which you can kind of argue specific policies about, you have this kind of bathing in nostalgias, whether it's make America great again or sort of Brexiteer fantasies about Britain. And again, this kind of overpowering cynicism, this sort of idea that there are no values to fight for, that everybody is as rotten as each other, which sort of comes through in so many of Donald Trump's interviews, that, the Russians do bad things, but we do bad things too. It's all the same. And with that, this term information war isn't used, but this idea that, any kind of criticism, that's just fake news. It's a hoax. It's a campaign. And, you hear that from politicians on the left, on the right. It's become almost normal, this kind of quasi-conspiratorial explanation of any kind of criticism. And I think the conspiracy thing, by the way, I should stop on that. That's very, very important. I mean, in the Russia that I lived in, conspiracies had become a way to explain the world. It wasn't just like there is one conspiracy, as in the Soviet Union, there was one conspiracy that, the evil bourgeoisie were behind everything. Conspiracies became a way to explain the world. Yeah, information war was part of that. All criticism is just information war. It's just a plot by someone. But, on TV, you had these non-stop shows, which were like a conspiracy inside a conspiracy inside a conspiracy. The whole world was ruled by kind of hidden hands that you could never really quite understand. And this conspiratorial way of looking at the world suddenly became centralized in the West as well. It was being, quoted by and repeated by senior political figures in the mainstream. And, I found myself pinching myself. I was like, what's going on? What's happened here? And to make it even worse, suddenly, everybody was writing about Putin's, Putin's actual disinformation campaigns in the West, when, all the evidence came through of the Kremlin's attempts to influence politics in America and in other countries. And so suddenly Putin was everywhere, looking at me, from the 10 o'clock news saying, aha, you thought you'd get away from me in London and Washington, but no, I'm everywhere now. Russia had gone from being kind of a fringe interest to, policy specialists, to being one of the great stories. And Russian propaganda was being talked about everywhere. And I was just like, what on earth has happened? How did our reality become so Russianized? I mean, was it really a case that, Putin had managed to implant his propaganda so deeply into the West? Or is there something more, is there something deeper at work? Is there something more systemic at work? Have we somehow arrived in a similar place to where Russia arrived to earlier? Did the future arrive first in Russia? And if so, why? That's kind of the question I try to sort of answer in my second book. And I don't know, we only have 20 minutes left already. I was going to read you a little bit from the book, but that'll take a lot of time while I kind of find the page and start talking much slower as I read. So I'll try to do it from memory. But there's a remarkable kind of interview that I did with a bunch of Russian spin doctors, and one spin doctor in particular, who was very, very interesting because he's a former Soviet dissident who then went on to work with Yeltsin and then to work on Putin's campaigns to become president. My books are full of interviews with propagandists. And obviously, when you interview propagandists, you always have to, like, 30%, you have to realize they're propagandizing themselves. So whenever you interview one of these guys, realize they're always over-promoting and overstating their own role. But whatever, there is still a kernel of reality there somewhere. And it was fascinating because he repeated, I mean, he very much echoed this idea. You guys have now got to where we got to in the 90s and 2000s. And this was his reasoning, which I think there's a lot to it. His reasoning was the following. While we had a Cold War, we had two competing systems, two competing rational Enlightenment systems, each of which with an idea of a rational future they were trying to achieve, a universal future they were trying to achieve, whether that's democratic capitalism or communism. And, you know, when you're searching for universal futures based on Enlightenment ideas, you need the language of factuality to kind of prove you're getting there. You know, factual language is deeply connected to an idea of a rational future. Look, here is my evidence for achieving where we're going. Here is our communist evidence to show we're achieving our utopia. Here's our capitalist democratic evidence to show that our system works. What started to happen in Russia in the early 1990s is, firstly, any vestiges and belief in communism are jettisoned. Probably people who didn't really believe in it for the last 20 years, at least anyway. But then very quickly, any kind of sense that democratic capitalism would bring prosperity for most people collapses probably by 1993. You know, that's when there's a brief utopian moment in the late 80s, early 90s. By the time Yeltsin is kind of bombing his own parliament, things are going very, very strange. And obviously the attempts at reform, you know, they benefit some people buy into it, but for many, 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 many people, they're disastrous. And he was describing to me what it was like working as a spin doctor in this environment. So all ideas of the future have disappeared. You can't really convince people with any rational future anymore because it's gone. So therefore, nostalgia starts becoming your main currency. But even deeper than that, he started talking about, look, you got to understand, all the sociological categories that we'd had were disappearing. You know, we used to think of the world in terms of the workers, the intelligentsia, political cadres, the army. All of this was falling apart. All the kind of the ways that we would define society were melting in front of our eyes. Whole ways of life were disappearing. Whole meanings that people gave themselves were disappearing in front of our eyes. The way we kind of constructed our politics between communists and anti-communists was falling apart as well. You couldn't really talk about left or right anymore. It didn't make sense in this kind of chaos of the mid-1990s. And so what you had to do when you were doing elections was really almost start afresh. You couldn't convince people with left versus right arguments. What you had to do was take every little interest group, every little, you know, subgroups that maybe had hated each other during communist times, like academics and KGB people, and find the thing, you know, find the one little thing that really motivated them individually, yeah, and do very, very targeted kind of salesmanship to that group, but also find them some amorphous big emotion that they could all buy into. And he talked about the Yeltsin campaign and the Putin campaign of 99. And for example, in the Putin campaign 99, what connected all these very, very different groups who really didn't have very much in common ideologically was a sense they'd all been left behind. So the Putin campaign of 1999 is to take together everyone who feels left behind. And that includes academics and military people, KGB people and students, and plug into each one of them and then unite them around this amorphous feeling that this is your last chance to succeed. And obviously unite them with an enemy, which in that time was, you know, the evil oligarchs, or the enemy that everybody could feel were the establishment that you wanted to fight against. So your job is to create a new idea of the people, the majority, the Putinskaya большинство, which I would hear about so much. This was something you had to create for every election, for every political cycle. Your job was to create these mass identities held together by emotion and resentment rather than ideas. The whole thing kind of imbued with a sense of nostalgia. And conspiracy thinking is very important here, because conspiracy thinking always helps to solidify an in-group and an out-group. There's us, the conspired against, and there's them out there, amorphous, unseen, but malign. And so conspiracy thinking became a way of pulling together, pulling your electoral bloc together. It was remarkable listening to Pawlowski, because recently I'd also, for my book, interviewed one of the guys, well, a bunch of pollsters and sociologists who'd worked on the Brexit campaign. And they described it in exactly the same ways, almost exactly the same ways. They talked about how over the last decades in Britain, distinctions of left and right had become increasingly irrelevant. How after 2008, especially the financial crisis, any idea of like a happy future that we're all heading towards had been severely undermined. Any kind of idea that kind of we're all heading to a joyous version of globalized democratic capitalism as kind of as advertised by The Economist had disappeared. Nostalgia was now in vogue. You can no longer kind of pitch your politics around an idea of left and right, about a rational idea of the future. Sociological categories were crumbling. You used to in Britain be able to define the electorate according to class in the 1980s and previously. That had disappeared. You used to be able to do it by kind of economic self-interest, Worcester woman, like certain types of woman who likes a certain kind of car, or a certain kind of man who drives a certain kind of truck. That had become irrelevant as well. All you could really do was find these sub-niche interests online, people who are into animal rights or people who really cared about immigration, and try to connect their very different concerns around an amorphous emotion, take back control, which could mean anything to anyone. It was meant to be as vague as possible, and unite that all around a vague, very mushy idea of the people that were being attacked by the enemy being, in case of Brexit, the Brussels, the establishment. And just like Pawlowski would tell me that, the problem with this sort of, I call it pop-up populism, is that it immediately collapses after an election. You can hold it together for a moment and it collapses. You've got to go back and reassemble it over and over and over again. These guys were like, as soon as this campaign is over, it falls apart, we have to restart anew. Or you stay in campaign mode forever, which is kind of the problem with this sort of politics. It tends to remain in campaign mode forever instead of ever starting to govern. And look, and throughout the book, I talk to spin doctors in Latin America. I mean, you can tell me to what extent this relates to the American example as well. And I find this pattern, I find the story repeating over and over. And it's very important sort of understanding the role of why have facts gone missing in all of these political discourses. Very important to understand the connection between factual discourse and idea of the rational future. Factual discourse was necessary while that idea of a rational future existed. As that falls away, the necessity for facts becomes much smaller and the demand becomes much smaller. If the facts just tell you unpleasant things, that your kids are going to be poorer than you, the facts aren't taking you somewhere good, then their values is hugely diminished. I mean, facts are quite unpleasant things. They tell us that we might be overweight, that we're not very rich, that we're not very successful. Facts are unpleasant. They're just useful if you're getting somewhere. And if you've lost that idea of where you're getting, if that idea of the future has disappeared, then facts stop, they start to lose their use. We can talk about when they become useful again, and what is that situation when facts become useful again, and when they become necessary again. But I think it's very striking that the one thing that Duterte, Bolsonaro, Orban, Putin, Kaczynski, Donald Trump, this whole carnival of populist irrationality that has sort of swept the world recently, what they all have in common is not being left or right. They're very liquid in their ideology. They can move around depending on their audience. What they all have in common is that they're all nostalgists. All of them talk about some sort of mythical past. None of them have a discourse about the future. And Russia kind of got there first. Russia was the first to kind of lose faith in communism, sure, and then also lose faith in democratic capitalism. We are kind of arriving there much later. We were still heading into some sort of future for a very long time. It was kind of a future on autopilot. Gleb Kovlowski talks about, like, you guys weren't even aware, but you were like, you all had these assumptions about the future you were going to, just loosely some sort of globalized democratic capitalism. And you didn't even notice how it became hollowed out as our ideas of communism, and then it started to come apart. So that's why I think the future arrived first in Russia. That's why the phenomena that we saw there first are now spreading everywhere. It isn't because they've managed to export their propaganda that effectively they've changed the whole political discourse everywhere. It's just we've all kind of arrived at the same place. See you next week. So next week we've done we've done why the future arrived first in Russia. Next week we're going to go across the world, and basically the theme for next week is how the ideals that we thought would guarantee a democratic information space, freedom of expression, pluralism, the idea of a marketplace of ideas, how all those kind of axioms, those building blocks of the agora that we're meant to live in, just name dropping the institute that I work in at Hopkins, what was meant to be our democratic information space, how all of them were turned upside down. So that's what we'll be talking about next week. And so think about that, start thinking about, okay, we've talked about all this messy stuff. What would be the positive things we want to think about in terms of ideas, in terms of technologies, because that's what we have to move towards. Okay, thank you very much, and I'll see you next week.